Welcome back to the YouTube studio here at Munich Security Conference. I'm Jack Kelly from TLDR News, and I'm joined this time by Baiba Braze, the NATO's Assistant Secretary General for Public Diplomacy. Very nice to have you here.
Well done.
Thank you.
Good to be here.
Let's start with the topic that everyone's talking about at the moment, Ukraine. It seems that Kyiv is somewhat resigned to the fact that they won't be joining NATO, at least in the short term. But once the war in Ukraine begins to wind down, what kind of security guarantees do you think NATO members will be able to offer Ukraine?
I think one important point is to underline that the political decisions that Ukraine will be a NATO member and Georgia has been made. It was made already in 2008, and it says that Ukraine and Georgia will be NATO members. They need membership action plan, so that is still not there. So it will depend. Our leaders reinforced that decision last year at Madrid summit, so it's full force. Obviously, on Russia's aggression against Ukraine, I think it's very important to use the terms precisely. So it's not conflict in Ukraine, it's not Ukrainian war, it's Russia's war against Ukraine. And it's not about winding it down, it's about Ukrainian victory. And Ukrainian victory comes on Ukrainian terms. It's not about us defining what is a victory. All the wars end at the negotiation table. That is surely a fact from the history that we know. One way or the other, whether it's capitulation, whether it's negotiation, when one side indicates that. Our task, because Ukraine is defending UN Charter, it fights literally for the international law, for the rights of self-defense that are all prescribed in the United Nations Charter. Our task as allies, as international community, is to support Ukrainian ability to fight and the will to fight. So all of us matter. You, Jack, matter. Your colleagues here at YouTube Studio, we all matter. It's not only about weapons. It's about also the ability, the will to fight. And then we can say that once Ukraine is there, that they are winning, that they define it as a win, we can say we all have done what we could to stand up for international law, for the principles, for the values that we ourselves freely have committed to, and that Ukraine has defended them with our help, and we all share in that victory.
I mean, on that point of the defining the terms of Russia's aggression, Putin's kind of expansion message, his narrative that the reason for the aggression is NATO expansion, seems to have picked up traction in some surprising areas of the world. It seems that in places like China, India, and even in Turkey, that narrative is making some headway. What are you doing to counter What are you doing to counter Putin's disinformation campaign, and how successful do you think NATO has been at doing that?
It's not only disinformation campaign, it's part of Russian warfare.
Yes.
The Soviets did that since Soviet Union was established. Even it was Soviet Russia first, the Soviet Union was not yet there. When Dzerzhinsky, the first head of the KGB in Russia, conducted quite efficient political warfare operations against Russian exiles in Paris and elsewhere, and against the Western countries, nothing has changed. All the methods are integrated, the political aims are there, and today we have not only kinetic operations, cyber, we have energy or economic, we have financial influence, we have information influence, and all types of other influence operations that Russia has integrated in its toolbox. So we have to be very clear that we understand what is being done. It's being done not only against the allies, but also against the rest of the world. And clearly in Africa, we have seen that Russia is trying to use a diplomatic instrument of power, economic instrument of power, information instrument of power, and probably quite another, the military instrument of power via Wagner. So it's about influencing the countries that are sovereign countries in Africa to achieve Russia's political aims. So what we are doing at NATO, we are of course explaining, we are discussing this, we are making sure that journalists from all around the world know that, even though NATO doesn't have operations directly in NATO, we are not in NATO. NATO is a peace project for its members.
Yeah.
NATO is there for 75 years to make sure that our populations as defensive alliance are safe and secure. That people like you, people like everyone here, their studies, their dreams, their future dreams, and their children have the peace and security that they need to have. That's why NATO has been established. And of course, for the countries in Africa or elsewhere, it's very important that the governments, that journalists, that all the key opinion formers understand what Russia is up to. So it's not only for NATO to explain that, it's for all the allies, it's for journalists, it's for the whole society to really make sure that the knowledge that we have is shared across the world. This is not some benevolent actor going after, oh, how nice you are, but they have very clear political aims.
Speaking of NATO's influence, it's clear that there's been a real reinvigoration of NATO in the last kind of year or so, because it was only a couple of years ago that even President Macron described the organization as brain dead. Do you think that reinvigoration is permanent now going forward, or do you think we could see NATO's influence wane again?
NATO really started understanding the big change that was happening after Russia's response in Georgia in 2008, where it tried to go, where de facto invaded Georgia and tried to occupy parts of it, and actually did administratively. So the big change started coming then, and then 2014 Russia invaded Ukraine for the first time, and it really never stopped. So what we saw in Donbass was permanent fighting. It was not necessarily on the front pages of the papers or on top of our screens, but it was ongoing. So what NATO did was, of course, take this knowledge, this understanding into account. NATO changed significantly, making sure that our intelligence services work together, information is understood, our open source experts, all the analysts, people who follow literary technology, who follow what is happening on the ground, that they were sharing information, understanding what Russia was doing. So that's why when Russians already in 2021 started moving troops closer to Ukraine, remember there was, in the springtime, there was that big exercise. That time they did not conduct the second invasion into Ukraine, but they moved quite a lot of material, quite a lot of capabilities at the Ukrainian border. And then, of course, our intel services were seeing all of that. So they were alerting our publics, our journalists, the whole world to it. So when at the end of 21 and the beginning of 22, Russia started again moving substantial forces to Ukraine's borders, it was very clear that we were ready. We were ready. Our intelligence colleagues declassified quite a lot of information, put it out in the public knowledge. And that really helped to mobilize our societies. And people understood what was happening. It was not unexpected. Our technological companies were ready because the satellite images, the real life feeds that we were seeing, the sharing of what was happening in Ukraine through Ukrainian mobile phones, everything was there. So it was completely different from what it was in 2014 in that respect. So that created that ability, not only for NATO, but for all the allied societies, governments, private sector, NGOs, individuals, to really consolidate around support for Ukraine. And what we are seeing in NATO is that, and we poll our audiences regularly, we ask what people think, what they are saying, how they are feeling. The support for Ukraine is huge. It's very, very high. And the aspect, what I said about the values that Ukraine is standing up for, our values, is clearly appreciated among our publics.
On that kind of topic of what different people believe and different attitudes in different parts of NATO, there's beginning to be more of a divergence between Europe and the US on the issue of China. Do you think that this could begin to put NATO's unity under strain going forward in a similar way that Iraq did in the early 2000s?
Well, one thing is clear, that China has not been transparent either about its intentions or capabilities, what it is doing, military, hybrid, information, international law, and so on and so forth. So I think China being more transparent, actually talking to other countries about their intentions and plans would be very helpful to clarify these misunderstandings or lack of information or lack of transparency about the intentions. NATO describes China as a challenge, so it's not a threat, unlike Russia and terrorism, which is clearly identified as two threats for NATO. But also, in the same time, of course, we clearly see that in the information sphere, so my métier, China has become a hostile actor.
Yes.
It has joined Russia in anti-NATO rhetoric, in misinformation, disinformation, hostile information. We see it that China not only amplifies Russian messages, Russian narratives, but does try its own. They're not very successful. Our audience is not necessarily buying them. You know, people are not stupid. Our people, they have their values and their orientation is the right place. But China is trying. So in that respect, I don't think there is a big difference between Europe and the US. At least we don't see that in fact. And obviously, which course China chooses to chart in the future, there are opportunities for cooperation, like on climate. You know, China is, without China, the fight for climate change becomes very difficult. So there are other opportunities. So I think it's important to also engage China and to not sort of look at China just, you know, from one spectrum, from one angle, but yeah, both engage and also be very clear on how we see certain things that are happening.
It's not just China and Asia, though, that's getting a lot of attention at the moment. It's clear over the last few months that many NATO member states, especially the US, are taking a special interest in the Asia-Pacific region. In fact, Jens Stoltenberg recently went to Japan and South Korea. Do you think it's likely that we'll ever see an Asian nation join NATO or any non-European?
Well, Asian nations can join NATO unless the Washington Treaty is changed. The NATO's founding treaty is very short. It's just 14 articles, very clear. But one of those articles speaks about new countries joining, and it says it has to be a European country. So quite clearly, countries in Asia would not be able to join under that criteria. However, we have really good partners in many places in the world. And what it means having a partner for NATO, it means that different countries, of course, see things differently. But what they care about is security. And they understand that in certain angles, NATO is the best partner. So we provide quite a lot of training to a number of countries. And they are in the Middle East, they are in Caucasus, for example, Georgia, but in Balkans, but also with Indo-Pacific partners, it's very clear that it's not only about values, about democracies, about understanding what is rules-based international system that is being challenged by a number of authoritarian actors, but it's also about this communality, the way they do things, their knowledge on certain threats and on certain threat vectors and actors, sharing them with allies, but also allies sharing that with the countries there. So again, perspectives can be different. You know, New Zealand is different from Japan and so on and so forth. But having those exchanges, having those partnerships makes us all more secure.
Absolutely. And sticking with the topic of accession, what do you think the prospects are for Sweden's accession into NATO? It's proving to be a little difficult. What do you think about that going forward?
Well, Finland and Sweden are both some of the best partners that we have. There have been democracies and the closest partners for NATO. I think that there are. And that was another of Putin's failures when both countries who were politically aligned but military neutral decided to join NATO. And it has been the fastest accession process this far. So since they were invited to join in Madrid last year. So we believe that we will get there. It's taking a bit longer than we thought. But again, Turkey's concerns. Turkey's concerns were legitimate concerns, and countries are addressing them. So I think the progress has been good. It will come. For now, it's important to support Turkey with the consequences of the earthquake and really, really make sure that they're able to recover and reconstruct.
Absolutely. Since Putin's invasion of Ukraine, the EU started developing more of an independent and muscular security policy. In the future, if Europe continues down that path, do you think that undermines NATO, or do you think it improves the strength of the organization?
The capability, the real capability, military capability in NATO comes from non-European partners and from non-European allies, the US, Turkey, Canada, Norway. So we have to be very clear that what NATO provides, the ultimate security, the collective defense capability cannot be duplicated. And that is also included in the EU-NATO joint declaration that was just signed, clearly stating NATO's role in collective defense. Having said that, of course, there are so many areas where both EU and NATO can work together. The membership is not very different. And with Finland and Sweden joining, of course, it will be very few countries who are outside NATO, but are members in the EU. So whether that's military security, I mean, also on security per se, sharing the understanding of threats, sharing the understanding of a variety of hybrid elements, but also military mobility, resilience, standardization of defense production. There is so much that can be done together, so much.
Absolutely. NATO is often described as the world's most successful military alliance. But despite that, some countries, some member countries, including Greece and Turkey, have a majority of their population who disapprove of NATO. Why do you think that is, and what is NATO doing to try and improve that situation?
NATO is the most successful political military alliance, and it's a defensive alliance. As I said, it's a peace project for its NATO's, for its members, for almost 75 years. And people can have different opinions, but ultimately, when we look at the numbers and when we look at the commitment of the political and military decision makers, they all want to be in NATO. They all want to share that peace project and make sure that also the future generations in our countries do that.
Amazing. Thank you so much for your time. It's been really great to get your insight on this.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you.